So without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Jonathan Foley. John is a world-renowned climate scientist, and he's our executive director here at Project Drawdown. During today's webinar, John is going to share Project Drawdown's new science-based plan for halting climate change while there's still time. The plan is based on the recognition that to avoid climate catastrophe, we need to head in the right direction as quickly, safely, and equitably as we can. And that means being strategic about every bit of time, energy, and funding to put into adopting climate solutions. So without any further delay, take it away, John.
Well, thank you, Elizabeth, for the kind introduction, and thanks to my colleagues, Jamie and Todd, who are here backstage with us for this webinar. And thank you so much for all the incredible gift of your time today. So many people on this webinar, which is fantastic. Thank you for spending a little time with us today. As Elizabeth said, I want to give an update of some work that we've been doing at Project Drawdown around advancing climate solutions. And, that's our mission, is to help the world stop climate change as quickly, safely, and equitably as possible. And today I'm going to talk about some advances we're making along that, but also just a little bit about updating what we're doing as an organization as a whole, too. So let me share some slides with you, and we'll take it away. And there'll be some time for a Q&A towards the end, as Elizabeth mentioned. So we should be all set for that. Okay, so here we are in the year 2023, and we're really in a race now. We're in a race between two very different futures on this planet. One future is the one we've been hearing a lot about lately, the one where we don't get it right, the one where we let climate change go unabated and the impacts get worse and worse every day. This is a world we don't want, a world that's affecting the most vulnerable people and the most vulnerable ecosystems around the world. And the impacts are negative and growing, and the future here could be very, very bleak. We don't want this future at all. But increasingly, I'm beginning to believe more and more in this future. This is the one that Project Drawdown, and I think all of us want to see and are working so hard for. This is a future where we get it basically right, where we do, in fact, stop climate change from getting a lot worse into the catastrophic end of the range of impacts. And along the way, we end up building a better world for everyone. And, I've been working on climate change issues in one way or another for about 30 years now, and I've never been more optimistic about our chances. Because new technologies, new policies, new movements, new businesses, new markets, new everything is starting to grow and grow exponentially. And these are starting to seriously begin the process of halting climate change. We now have a real shot at this to build a more sustainable, but also more prosperous, secure, and equitable world. And I'm convinced that we can win this race if we really put our minds to it. But to win this race, we have to know what's holding us back and why we haven't won it already. What's holding us back? What are the things that we have to overcome? What are the big obstacles? Well, I think there are three big obstacles that have held us back so far. One is all the noise and confusion out there. We don't really know what to do, let alone how to do it, because we're hearing so many different things with competing claims and competing agendas and competing voices out there. How do we know what's true and what's right? We're also somewhat encumbered by people who want to delay us and distract us from stopping climate change. It's no longer credible to deny that climate change is real. You just get laughed out of any serious room. But there are people who do want to delay us and to distract us from taking action because they're making a lot of money in the meantime. And so we have to know what is a delay tactic and how to move around it and get to work and move the solutions forward. And also, so much today, we're feeling a lot of doubt and despair and kind of eco-anxiety, climate grief, other really, really serious feelings about how much we are losing and how bad things could be. But we have to move through that and beyond it to take action and make sure that we're not trapped in our despair and anxiety, but we move through that and move to the world we can build moving forward. So to move forward and build this better future, we're going to have to do some interesting things. We're going to have to cut through all that noise and confusion and follow the science about what it tells us moving forward on climate solutions. How do we get that and get it right? We also have to call out the folks who are trying to delay and distract us and show bold leadership and really move confidently into this future and move quickly. And also we have to move past the doom and despair. and embrace hope and possibility for the better future that we can build. So today I want to talk to you about all three of these things and talk to how we can move forward on climate solutions, moving past each of these three areas. So let's get started. So the first part I want to talk about is how we can use science to cut through all the noise and confusion. How do we know what we should do and the best way to do it? Whenever I think about this, I end up thinking about Matt Damon for some reason. You know, Hollywood spent a lot of money, billions of dollars, in fact, trying to save Matt Damon from really sticky situations. Well, in this movie, I get kind of inspired because Matt Damon in the movie The Martian is stranded on Mars all by himself. Just by some weird accident, he's left behind. His crewmates rocket back to Earth, leaving him behind to survive all by himself in this inhospitable Martian landscape. And his character happens to be a scientist. And he says, you know, in order to survive, you just begin. You do the math. You solve one problem, then you solve the next one, and then the next. And this is my favorite line. He says, you only have one option. You're going to have to science the shit out of this. Well, that's what we're going to have to do on climate change as well. We're going to have to science a you-know-what out of this to figure out what do we do? What's the math we do now and solve one problem and then the next and then the next? Well, science has been part of our journey so far, but only part. We've listened to the science about the problem of climate change. In fact, we created the world's largest and most powerful assemblage of scientists ever in human history. This thing called the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Tens of thousands of scientists and engineers and policy experts worked on the IPCC for the last 3 decades. It brought together tens of thousands of people producing tens of millions of pages of publications, of data and reports, and so on. And it very clearly articulated the point that, yes, climate change is real, we're causing it, it is having serious impacts, and it is likely to grow into the future. So we listened to the science and then some about the problem of climate change. The best science in the world told us about the problem. But about solutions, I don't know what happened, but we stopped listening to the scientists. Now we're just listening to just anybody with an opinion. Whether it's on Facebook or Twitter or just some random person on the street, we seem to listen to anybody who's trying to sell us their solution and their ideas about how to stop the climate crisis. Here are a few from this morning. But no, that's not the way to go forward. Just like we listen to scientists about the problem, we have to listen to what science says about solutions as well. We can't go to the world's best doctors to diagnose our illness and then just talk to random quacks on Facebook for the cure. That doesn't make sense. So let's listen to the science and figure out what it tells us about stopping climate change. Well, Drawdown did the first work on this already. We did a couple of years ago a huge body of work to identify what are viable potential solutions. And we created what we call now the Drawdown Solutions Library. It's basically about 100 well-researched solutions where we did the assessments of what were economically and technologically feasible. Basically, it's a list of these are the things that could actually work. If they're on this list, we say, yep, they're a working solution. This is true, this works, this will make a dent. If they're not on this list, they're not yet a solution. There may be a promising idea out there still in the laboratory, or maybe they're a dangerous distraction that's not going to help at all and only serves to delay action on climate change. But here are the viable solutions. We have a whole bunch of them, about 100 in all, and they cover all the spectrums of things we need to worry about on climate change, whether it's electricity here, ways we can reduce the need for electricity by being more efficient, or generating electricity without burning fossil fuels, whether it's with wind, solar, nuclear, concentrated solar, geothermal, and so on. We've got it all covered here. We also have solutions in food and agriculture and land use and transportation and, well, everything else. And we've done the most exhaustive work in the world to try to identify what the potential solutions to climate change might be. But listing potential solutions isn't enough. We also have to learn how. How do we implement these potential solutions so they become real solutions operating in the world, actually stopping climate change? How do we go from paper to reality? Well, it turns out we can listen to science again here because there are some really important rules that we have to know in order to implement climate solutions, kind of the science of how. How do we do it? The most important of which is to make sure that we align our efforts with time. Time is by far the most important variable when it comes to climate change, but it's often neglected and people often get it wrong. So let me show you why time is so critical and what we can learn from the process of time and climate solutions to get the right results. Well, the pathways to stop climate change all travel through time, and they all work against a racing clock. And here's what it looks like. The red curve shows the levels of pollution we have been emitting every year since about the 1970s. They were high and they've been going up pretty much steadily until this year in the red dot. That's where we are today. Today, we emit about 59 billion tons of CO2 equivalent greenhouse gas pollution. That's the pollution side of the street, and that is a terrible, terrible curve. It's going up just the way we don't want to see. If we were to extrapolate the last 50 years into the next 30 years or so, it would probably look like this. It would continue to be more and more pollution as the world's economy grows, as we burn more fossil fuels, and so on and so on. But we don't want to do that. We don't want to go from bad to worse. We need to go the other direction. We need to dramatically cut emissions. We need to cut them very steeply in the next decade or so, probably cutting them 40 to 50% in the next 10 to 15 years to have a shot at landing in the Paris Accords. As you might recall, the Paris Accords is the international agreement to stop climate change between 1.5 and 2 degrees of warming. We're already around 1.1 degrees of warming, so that means kind of stopping the brakes so we don't get beyond 1.5 to 2 degrees. But if we went down business as usual, we'd be heading towards 4 or 5 degrees of warming, which would be truly catastrophic. So to land in the Paris Accords, again, we have to cut emissions drastically in the next decade or so, and then keep cutting through the middle of the century. And by 2050, we need to cut almost all of the emissions of greenhouse gases, or as many as are possible. But there are probably going to be some remaining greenhouse gas emissions, even in 2050 and beyond. Maybe some countries don't get on board, or there's some industries we just don't know how to decarbonize very effectively, like making fertilizers or steel or cement. Things like this might be these small residual emissions. That's where the green curve will come in. This is called carbon removal. Above and beyond what nature already does, we humans could also try to remove some greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere, especially the carbon dioxide part. And this is what we're calling carbon removal. We could do that with nature by planting billions of trees around the world, or farming our soils differently so they store more carbon each year. That would be great. Or we could use machines that remove carbon out of the atmosphere and tuck it into the geologic reservoirs under our feet. So we have nature-based and kind of engineering-based carbon removal concepts being talked about. The problem is it's effectively zero right now, at least on this scale in the billions of tons range. Even with all the effort for the last 50 years in this kind of work, which has been going on for a long time now, and billions of dollars spent, we're still about 1/1,000,000th of 1% of our emissions are being deliberately captured by these carbon capture projects and these carbon removal schemes. So it's still very, very small. We'd have to grow it up about 1,000,000-fold by mid-century to meet that red curve and take out the last remaining emissions. So the idea here, again, is we would cut emissions drastically, especially early on, and then keep cutting almost all of them till the middle of the century. And then we'd take carbon removal, which is a great idea, but it's about 1,000,000 times too small to matter right now, and grow it up in the next 3 decades so that the two curves meet and we have what we finally call net zero. Net zero means mostly zero emissions. We've cut most of them, but we take out the last remaining with some combination of nature-based or technology-based carbon removal projects. And that's the hope. And the minute we hit net zero is when climate change stops getting a lot worse. So why is time so important? Well, most of all, because early action is critical. We have to start bending the curve now. That's the big part that most people already notice. The other part of time that's so important is that climate solutions are cumulative over time. The climate problem is cumulative, as you know. The warming we're seeing today is because greenhouse gases have built up in the atmosphere for the last 150 years. It didn't just happen overnight or just last year. It happened over a century and a half. That's because the gases build up slowly over time, adding to that thicker and thicker blanket. Well, stopping that also takes time and takes cumulative action. This will not be solved in 1 year. It has to be solved every year, cumulatively, between now and the middle of the century. Let me show you what I mean. When we cut emissions in the 2020s and early 2030s, we could have been preventing this much carbon from going into the atmosphere, that whole blue area. The difference between that dashed line of where we might have been going and the solid line is where we want to be going. The difference between those two curves, that whole area between the curves, is the cumulative impact of our work. And that much total amount of pollution was never emitted into the atmosphere. But the beautiful thing about 2020 solutions, the solutions we could be taking this decade and into the 2030s, they can keep working. If these solutions are permanent, then the solutions we implement in the 2020s keep paying off in the 2030s and the 2040s and beyond. That total cumulative area between now and mid-century started today and kept on paying off into the future. Think of it as the kind of dividends paid by current solutions out into the future. And then in the 2030s, we can do some more emissions cuts because we got to those emissions in the 2030s and we can have this much impact. But by the 2040s, our window of opportunity to have a big impact starts to shrink. And so, yes, we'll need to keep cutting emissions in the 2040s, but they're going to have a much less impact than the same actions would in the 2020s because there's a cumulative impact over time. It's not just how many tons per year your solution gives you, it's how many years was it working. This is why again and again and again, we seem to get this confused, but this is why short-term immediate solutions here today, near-term solutions are always, always, always more effective than far-away high-tech solutions that aren't here yet because they have more time to work. It's just a simple math problem. It's the area under the curve, not the final value on the curve that matters. Again, this is why high-tech solutions, things about talking about fusion, which has been talked about for 60 years and always seems to be 20 years away. That might be something of a distraction because every year we wait for it is another year we didn't do something else and didn't get the problem solved. Or modular nuclear reactors, or relying too much on carbon removal, which will show up someday, but it's going to be very small. We need to work with the solutions we have now and accumulate their impact. An analogy here might be saving for retirement. You don't wait until you turn 64 and then start saving for your retirement years. Then you start in your 20s and do a little bit every year, accumulating a larger and larger impact over time. This is the most important lesson about climate solutions is early action pays dividends. These are cumulative impacts and we have to start now. That's why at Drawdown, we always say now is more important than new and time is more important than tech. Now with carbon removal, we will need carbon removal by mid-century and it's been talked about a lot lately, but remember, it's a cumulative impact because it's starting from basically zero. And even after 50 years of scaling it, it's still very, very small. It's going to take a while for it to take off. And even in the best case scenarios, carbon removal will be an important but relatively small part of the total equation of what we have to do to stop climate change. So the math is pretty incontrovertible. We know that emissions cuts are most of the answer. In this case, about 96% of this answer of getting to this scenario. And emissions cuts we start in the first decade are over 3/4 of the total work we need to do to stop climate change. These are emissions cuts we start now and hold out into the middle of the century. Carbon removal is crucial, but in this scenario is about 4% of the total answer, even though in 2050 it may be 10% of the emissions, but its cumulative impact is only 4%. So this reminds us that just like money, there's a time value of climate solutions. Early action pays dividends, and faraway solutions, ones in the distant future, new technologies, have to be discounted severely for their total impact. We can even estimate the kind of net present value, as economists might call it, of solutions deployed today or in the future. But every year we wait, we have to discount their effectiveness severely compared to solutions that are ready now. So what does this teach us? It teaches us that we need to align our climate solutions, not only make them viable, but make sure we're doing them in the right order and have a balanced portfolio of climate action over the coming decades. At Drawdown, we talk a lot about what we call emergency brake solutions, things that could be deployed instantly and bend the curve on emissions right away, that don't wait for technologies or infrastructure or nature or other things that take time. So what are emergency brakes? Well, stopping deforestation would be my personal top pick, because deforestation is about 11% of the world's emissions today. Huge amount of emissions. It's actually larger than the United States emissions of the entire US economy is just deforestation. Stopping deforestation immediately stops emissions. If you don't burn down the tree, the CO2 was never emitted. Plus all the benefits to future carbon storage, biodiversity, watersheds, and of course, communities who live in and near these forests. So stopping deforestation will be my personal pick for number one, but also plugging methane leaks in the energy infrastructure, because methane is a powerful greenhouse gas, especially in the near term. Plugging methane leaks in pipelines, natural gas wells, and so on, which we now can detect from space and pinpoint exactly where they are, can have a big kind of emergency brake effect on future climate change, buying us time for the next wave of solutions. Other things might be stopping black carbon emissions, or soot, which is another powerful warming agent that works quickly on the atmosphere, reducing contrails from aviation, stopping Bitcoin mining, things like the huge energy inefficiencies that could just be turned off, that could massively improve emissions today without any kind of delay. At the same time, though, we need to start building out new infrastructure. We start that today too, but recognize infrastructure pays off in future years and future decades, because it takes a while to retrofit buildings. It takes a while to build new agricultural systems, new transportation systems, and so on. Think of electric vehicles. In North America, for example, where I live, it turns out the average car lasts on the road about 18 years from purchase to going to the final disposal. So even if we sold nothing but electric vehicles today, it'll still take a decade or two to kind of flip over the entire vehicle fleet. So we need to know that infrastructure starts now, but pays off into the future, just like everything else will. We also can invest in people in ways that reduce emissions in the future, whether it's helping indigenous communities, investing in health and education around the world. But that also pays today and out into the future with some time lags. Nature-based climate solutions are some of my favorite, like planting new trees, doing things like this, building up soils, regenerative agriculture. These are fantastic, but you have to remember that soils and trees take years and decades to accumulate carbon. There's a built-in time lag. Trees don't pop out of the ground fully formed. They take a long time to grow. That's why we should be planting them like crazy now, knowing that they'll pay off in future decades. And then, of course, new technologies, which we should be investing in left and right now, knowing that they can pay off in the 2030s, 40s, and beyond. But we need this whole portfolio of immediate, medium-term, and long-term solutions so that we can bend the curve and keep bending it appropriately between now and mid-century. That's why aligning our resources with time is so, so critical. And waiting more on short-term, near-term solutions that work now is critical and not being done enough. We also have to focus our work on geographic kind of opportunities or hotspots, because climate solutions are not the uniform number you might think they are everywhere in the world. In our early work in Drawdown and in the IPCC, we sometimes put out numbers for the world for climate solutions, but in fact, they vary enormously from place to place. Our future work is going to be building what we call a Drawdown Explorer that'll show pinpoint by pinpoint, kind of at the pixel level, how climate solutions could be more effective in different places. So spatially mapping climate solutions everywhere in the world, but at the local level. Here's an example of what that could look like. Here's a database of every power plant in the world showing how much CO2 is emitted for every unit of electricity produced. The red ones are the biggest emitters by far compared to the yellow and green ones. So if you're trying to retire fossil fuel plants to cut carbon emissions, you start with the red ones. There's a kind of 80-20 rule here. In the United States, in fact, it's about 75% of the emissions came from 25% of the power plants. So these are the ones we retire quickly if we can. Or, for example, protecting the rainforest across the Amazon basin in South America. The forest isn't uniform. Some parts of the forest in deep red contain far more carbon than other areas. So from a climate point of view, and just a climate point of view, those are the areas that need the most protection. Of course, you want to overlay maps of biodiversity, indigenous communities, air quality, watershed issues, and so on to come up with a better kind of prioritization of which regions of the Amazon must be protected most importantly. And that's something we've been working on for a while now, is how do you determine geographic priorities for climate solutions around the world? Because we can take advantage of these kind of hotspots and 80-20 rules. We also need to think about more than climate. Climate solutions are fantastic, but they shouldn't be considered in isolation, because we can see how climate solutions, every one of these circles is a drawdown verified climate solution, one that we say is this is a really viable solution and that could be working here in climate change. But we went through all of these looking for those that could also benefit people, especially the world's poorest people, people who live under about $1.90 a day, living in extreme poverty in low and middle income countries. So we identified about 28 different strategies that take climate solutions on the left and how they affect the carbon going into the atmosphere. But we also found huge benefits to human well-being around equity and justice and human health and other aspects of well-being that could also be seen from these so-called climate solutions. They had co-benefits back to people. So climate solutions that improve access to food or income and work, water and sanitation, health, gender equality, and so on and so on. So when we think about climate solutions, where are there possible kind of win-wins with human well-being, but also with biodiversity, water, and other things we have to solve for at the same time? That's an important thing to think about when we implement climate solutions as well. So beyond aligning our climate solutions with time, geography, and co-benefits, we also need to make sure we put our resources in the right place. And this is an area where we have a lot of opportunity to improve. So at Project Drawdown in the last year or so, we've been looking at something called the Drawdown Roadmap, which has identified exactly what we need to do to stop climate change and how to best do it. What we've concluded, as you can see already, is cutting emissions is critical. About 91% of the work we need to do to stop climate change is cutting emissions in these 6 areas: electricity, food and agriculture and land use, industry, transportation, building operations, and other energy kind of emissions. And about these proportions, this is the kind of roadmap of where the carbon is. And we know where it is and how to cut it. We know how we can cut these emissions through gaining efficiencies like energy efficiency, cutting food waste, more efficient diets, and so on, and then decarbonizing what's left. And we've been very carefully mapping exactly where this carbon is. We know where it is. We know exactly where the carbon is and what to do about it. We also know how we can cut emissions indirectly. And on top of cutting emissions directly in these 6 economic sectors, we can reduce emissions indirectly by investing in people. Again, like how investing in indigenous communities can help improve land tenure and land protection of, let's say, rainforest in communities that are living in the forest. That can lower deforestation rates, which later reduces emissions. Likewise, investing in health and education around the world can bend future economic and demographic curves in ways that reduce emissions in the future as well. So again, this is where investing in people first results in emissions cutting down later. So we have direct and indirect emissions cuts, and then we have carbon removal, that last 4%. So here's, if you will, kind of the portfolio of carbon that the planet has to address between now and Paris. And we know exactly where the carbon is. And we also know what the solutions are within each of these areas, because Drawdown did all the work on this. Here's, again, our solutions library in each of these sectors. Solutions in electricity, solutions in food and agriculture, solutions in transportation. These are all ready to go right now to get to work. So we not only know what to do in this kind of portfolio, we know how much to do in each of these bigger categories. So this is a very detailed portfolio of solutions and relative areas that need to focus in order to build a portfolio of action that will stop climate change between now and mid-century. Well, that's the portfolio we need. How does that compare to the portfolios we get? So one of the things we did is to track the money. We compared where the money is going in climate solutions to where the solutions are actually needed, which is the top bar. Well, here's where the money's actually going, whether it's philanthropy or venture capital or the United States government. Here are just 3 examples of different pools of money that are being thrown at climate solutions. The first one in philanthropy is doing a pretty good job, maybe over-invested in carbon removal. Maybe they think it's going to be a bigger solution than the math says it will be, but okay, that's good. Most of that's nature-based carbon removal in this category. Or in industry, though, it's underinvested in the emissions that come from the industrial sector. We need more philanthropy there to jumpstart new projects and de-risk them so that private capital will follow. Or in the other energy category, it's hard to find any kind of investments at all, really, that are called that. So we need to figure out what's going on there. The most bizarre, though, is the middle category where venture capital, that's $90 billion a year, roughly, more than 3 times what the federal government's been spending lately on climate solutions. It's private capital going into new technologies and new ventures. But 2/3 of it went into one category, transportation. In fact, almost all of that went into one technology, electric vehicles and electric scooters. Well, that's important, but maybe it's about 5% of what the Earth needs, but it became 66% of where Silicon Valley and others put their money. Now, that maybe is where the returns are and where the technologies are at the moment, but in the long term, this needs to be rebalanced somewhat to be deploying resources that not only make money, of course, because this is a private sector, but also really address the climate problem in a more strategic way. There are business opportunities in the other areas that could make just as much as electric vehicles. We just need to be creative and find them and resource them and make sure that we get the capital that's needed. And finally, the lower bar is the US government's new Inflation Reduction Act, which will spend about $37 billion a year over the next decade. It is deliberately and very seriously weighted towards electricity now. The idea is that will help reduce emissions in electricity, kind of a low-hanging fruit, and that's fine. And the idea is it will unlock solutions in the future in industry, transportation, and buildings by making it easier to have electric vehicles, heat pumps, and so on. And that makes some sense too. But we need to make sure that the capital flows to these other areas in the long term as well. We could have a green grid and nobody's using it if we don't make sure we put resources into these other categories in a more balanced way. So as a first installment of government funding, this might make a lot of sense, but in the long term, we need some rebalancing. In a couple of weeks, we'll be actually briefing the White House on this and how in future kind of climate investments, depending on what happens with future elections, we hope to see a little bit more long-term reallocation of capital to address all of these problems, not just electricity and a few others. So the idea here is we know we have solutions to climate change, but we also need science plans that tell us how to implement these solutions. It'd be like pouring a whole bunch of pieces from an IKEA furniture item out onto the floor, but you don't have the instructions of how to put it together. So now we have all the pieces. We've had that for a while, and now we have the instructions about how to put it together. The good news is we can still do this and we can stop climate change, but we can't waste 1 minute or $1 on the things that don't work. And Drawdown is now helping to laser focus these actions to have the best chance of stopping climate change. So that's the first part of what we wanted to talk to you about today, is the science about how we implement climate solutions to make sure we do it in the most effective way possible. A couple other things I wanted to talk to you all about today too, though, are about how we can call out the delays and distractions happening in the world and really show more bold leadership, especially in the private sector. Because our work at Drawdown Labs, my colleague Jamie Alexander, who will be up towards the end here during Q&A, her team has been leading some amazing work about how to galvanize leadership in the private sector, because the private sector has an opportunity and we think the obligation to elevate leadership. It's not enough to just say, yeah, we'll be net zero by mid-century and not really mean it, or just to buy some offsets. And then at the same time, still give money to politicians who are undermining climate leadership or not thinking about the larger business model or where your finances are going and so on. So Jamie's team at Drawdown Labs has built this amazing guide for businesses called the Drawdown Aligned Business Framework. And it has multiple parts of what climate leadership should really look like. They're not about vague net zero pledges. They're about cutting emissions now and being very clear in your disclosure about what you're cutting. Not just hiding behind an offset, but here's what we really cut, and here's where we're buying offsets, and making sure we don't conflate the two, or leaning too hard on imaginary things that maybe aren't cutting emissions at all. We also have to advocate for climate policies from business. When Congress members, like that ad I showed in the previous slide, an ad we put out in the New York Times with about 20 leading businesses, policymakers pay even more attention to environmental issues when businesses talk about it, not just environmentalists. They're used to us coming to the politicians, seeing the environmentalist and the scientist. Sure, they'll pay a little bit of attention, but when business shows up too and says, yeah, we want climate action as well, because it's good for business and it's necessary for a thriving economy in the long term, policymakers finally really pay attention. We also need to see different business model transformations, different kinds of partnerships and procurement systems. This is interesting. We also need to make sure companies are investing their money in ways that are aligned with climate leadership. In some companies, it's the cash balance sheet, especially if a large technology company, for example, that might have the biggest impact on climate change. If that money is invested in, maybe in fossil fuel companies, for example, or the 401k and retirement and pension plans of different businesses. If you're a climate leader, you want to make sure that your money is aligned with climate leadership too, not just your operations or just your rhetoric. We need to align everything with climate leadership. And the Drawdown Labs team has really pioneered collaborating with business what a truly drawdown aligned business could look like. No business in the world is here yet, but many are starting to make big strides in these different categories. And we want to push them harder to make sure business really takes on this incredible opportunity and obligation to be true leaders in climate change. Finally, in part 3 here, I wanted to talk about the last kind of big obstacle to talking about climate action here. It's how do we move past the doom and the despair that kind of permeates our conversations today and help embrace more of a sense of opportunity and possibility and, dare say, even hope. Because right now, the climate conversation is broken, and it feels really a lot like this. And there's some strange paradoxes in climate communication today. One of the weird paradoxes is, believe it or not, people already believe climate change is real. We don't have to worry about that anymore. In the United States, in fact, about 92% of Americans believe climate change is real or could be real, whatever. But only 8% are stubbornly saying, no, it's not real. I'm digging in my heels. I don't believe it. It's a conspiracy, whatever. It's only 8%. 92% believe you. So take the win and move on. So not only did 90-something% of Americans believe in climate change, about 60% are alarmed and concerned about it. They believe us and they know it's serious and they're kind of worried about it. So we don't have to keep beating them over the head with scary images telling them how bad it is and how much they should believe us. They're already there. We won this battle about 5 years ago, but we keep hammering people again and again and again with scary messages about climate change. And there are also abstract issues about climate change. It's big, it's scary, but it's still kind of abstract to my daily life. And that's why we have this big disconnect. Even though 92% of Americans believe in climate change and 60% are alarmed or concerned about it roughly, only 2% of Americans see climate change as a, quote, top issue facing the nation. It's never been more than 2%, and I don't think it's ever going to be more than 2% in the near term. Here are the issues, though, that Americans do see as top issues: jobs, inflation, rising energy prices, gas prices, equity issues, justice issues, neighborhood issues, health, and security. All of these things, though, are connected to climate. If climate change gets worse, all of these things will get worse too. So we ought to make that connection more clear. But more important than that, way more important than that, is the flip opposite of this, the reverse. If climate solutions start to happen, they make all these things you care about better. Climate solutions create jobs. They help reduce inflation. You know why they called it the Inflation Reduction Act and not a Green New Deal? Because it spoke to what Americans wanted to hear. It spoke to American issues and everyday kitchen table issues. And this is true in almost every country in the world. Instead of trying to drag the population to the extremes of climate activism, instead, let's meet them where they are and talk about issues that matter to the majority of the population, the other 98% of us, for example. So talk about jobs that are created by climate solutions. Talk about how inflation, energy prices go down with climate solutions. Talk about the opportunities to address equity and justice in our neighborhoods with climate solutions. Talk about the health benefits, the security benefits, the community benefits, the things that matter at the kitchen table conversation because of climate solutions. That will connect us to what people actually care about and move this kind of vague fear and awareness of climate solutions to action on climate solutions. It's motivational and related to the issues people care about. We also need to move beyond fear, because most people on climate change are aware, they're scared, but they're disengaged. In fact, way more people report climate anxiety and fear about climate change than climate action that they're actually doing. So we have created awareness, but with so much fear and so much anxiety, we blew past awareness and now we're into anxiety. People are freaked out and disengaged on climate change because they're so terrified. Why are they terrified? They shouldn't be, because there's an incredible opportunity out here to change the world and make it better. A world where we stop climate change and we actually do a lot of great things that people care about right now. We have that opportunity. So why are people sitting on the sidelines being afraid? Well, it's because of us. It's because the media ecosystem and business behind it, the activism ecosystem, the political ecosystems are broken. They're emphasizing fear and division as a way of cutting through the noise. They use fear and polarization as a way of making money or winning votes or getting a bigger share of the media ecosystem and the competing voices in it. Every one of these things between media, activism, and politics is in a kind of death spiral, using fear and division and polarization as a weapon, basically, and a business model, and is feeding ourselves into this frenzy of fear and division and disengagement. We have to shift this conversation. We need, first of all, maybe new voices out here, more diverse voices, more authentic voices that can cut through, that people see themselves in this conversation, not just the privileged elite, too many middle-class white people, and so on. How do we get new and broader conversations happening with new voices that look like the communities we're trying to see served in this whole business? But most importantly, I think we also need not only new voices, we also need new messages along the way as well. Let me suggest one. Here's the message that I think we're hearing today. Whether it's about climate change or probably about anything else, it's a similar message. And it goes something like this. Tell me if you've heard this one before. You might hear somebody on Twitter or on cable news shouting at us, telling us the world is going to hell, and those bad people, the other people, whoever they are, they're the ones to blame for it. They're bad, and they're the reason we're in all this trouble today. And the solution is, if you get angry enough and you do what I tell you, you vote the way I tell you to, or you buy what I tell you to, we're going to beat the bad guys. Does that sound familiar? I've been hearing this for 20 to 30 years on climate and like everything else. And it's just in this death spiral where we just get angrier and angrier, more and more divided, and more fearful. And we're not really stepping up to our full potential to solve the problem. What if we had a different narrative, though? What if we had new messengers and new messages that said something like this? Hey, the world is actually beautiful and amazing, but it needs some help to stay that way. And it turns out we have the solutions we need. They're already here, but we need to work together and solve these problems. And along the way, we can create a better future. I don't know about you, but that's what I'm desperate to hear more of. And I'd like to see a much more fulsome conversation. Right now, in the United States, at least, 99% of the media coverage on climate change is about fear, division, and the bad boogie monster doom and gloom narrative that has been honed to an incredible level so far. Less than 1% of the coverage on climate change is about solutions. Less than 1% is about the people implementing them every day. It's got to be more than that. If we have any hope of building a better future, we first need to talk about it and show that it's possible. We can't get to a better future if we can't imagine it or even talk about it together. So that's something we need to do as well. All right, well, maybe some last thoughts, and then we'll turn it over to some Q&A and conversation towards the end. But I want to remind us all, I believe so strongly that we can choose a better future. But in order to get there, we're going to need some help along the way. And that's where Project Drawdown comes in. That's what we were designed to do. We have a couple of things we're going to try to offer the world, and I hope you can help us scale this up and make it a bigger impact in the world. But first and foremost, we need science to cut through all the noise of what we could do to what we need to do and guide the most effective actions. We don't need just science-based solutions. We need science-based strategies that get us to Paris, that stop climate change. If we don't do this, we lose the planet. But if we do it, we have a chance of building an incredible world. Drawdown's taking the lead on that. We're also a trusted advisor to key leaders. We're nonpartisan. We don't have any financial stake in any of these solutions or outcomes. And we just use science to speak the truth, even when it's uncomfortable. And we've become a really good and trusted advisor to like companies and investors, governments, communities, and philanthropists around the world. And we push them to do better. Also, I think it's really important for work like ours and others to be a source of inspiration. If all we hear is the bad news about climate change, it's just hard to get up in the morning and feel the kind of motivation we need to go change the world. It's hard work. We need to hear some examples of others doing this. We need to feel connected to solutions. We need to feel connected to other heroes out there in the world that are changing the conversation. And we also need to be connected to people we haven't seen yet. We need to make sure that new underrepresented heroes are here at the stage, and that we pass the mic and make sure this is a broader, more diverse, and more empowering conversation that connects all of us to each other and to opportunity. We also need to have a clear plan at Project Drawdown. We've been working really hard on ways to accelerate the world towards drawdown to stopping climate change. And we think that it's built on these three kind of key principles. How do we advance science-based solutions, but now science-based strategies to implement them? How do we foster bold climate leadership in the private sector and far beyond by unlocking all of those conversations and resources and obstacles that used to be there on climate change? How do we unlock those and have bold leadership in the private sector, but also in governments and communities and elsewhere around the world? And finally, how do we promote new narratives that inspire us and also have new voices that engage us and connect us to the larger population into the world that we have, this incredible diverse set of new heroes that are changing the world in incredible positive ways. So to wrap up, I want to just then turn this over to you. And here's my ask to all of you on this webinar today. The kind of work we do is really important, but we need your help to help make it really have the impact it could. We need your imagination, and you're challenging us to kind of think bigger and think bolder into the future. Your amplification, we're a small little nonprofit. We don't have a big PR budget like some big brands do. So could you help spread the word and kind of take what we're doing and get it in front of others on social media, elsewhere, in conversations you have, or anything you can do? That would be fantastic. We also love to hear from you and your connections, your expertise, your insights. And yeah, financial support, that's also really important. We're a nonprofit. We don't take money from governments. We don't do a lot of other things. So we need, the support from everybody, from people like you and beyond. And finally, I want to just say thank you for being here today, but also your support in helping us advance the mission to stop climate change, because that's what we have to do as quickly and safely and equitably as possible. And we could not do this without you. And so I believe together we can go change the future and build an amazing one. It's so easy to think that we live in the hardest, most difficult, challenging, dark, dismal time in human history, but that couldn't be farther from the truth. We live in an extraordinary time, building on so much sacrifice and hard work of all the generations that lived before us. We are 1 or 2 generations away from a world that could be amazing. And we're the first people in history to be able to say those words. We are 1 to 2 generations away from a world that is actually sustainable. A generation or 2 away from a world that eliminates poverty, eliminates illiteracy, and a lot of infectious disease. We could eliminate so much human suffering. We could have a world that is also equitable and just and fair and kind. We are the first people in history to even imagine that possibility. Now we're far from it, and we could still screw it up. but I really wake up every day believing and knowing that an extraordinary world is within our reach. Humanity could build a world we could be proud of. We can see it, we can taste it. It's just right out of our fingertips. It's just over there, right out of reach. But by working together, we can get there and build an incredible world that we'd be proud of. So with that, I'd just like to say, let's join together and collaborate in trying to build that world and making it possible. And again, thank you so, so much for being here today. And I'll turn it back over to our team to see if we can help answer some of the questions that might be coming up or comments you have. So thank you very, very much. I really appreciate it. Thank you so, so much.
Thanks, John. You can see lots of gratitude coming through in the emojis. So thank you so much for that. We've got a bunch of questions, and folks, I realized we unfortunately aren't going to be able to get to everybody's, but let's start, John, with a question about the investment business model world. There were lots of questions about people saying, well, how can we help investors, philanthropists, businesses move climate solutions forward from their vantage point, pull the levers that they have? What are your thoughts in that space?
Yeah, thanks for asking that. This is actually something we're working on a lot right now, is because one of the big levers that we need to pull is, frankly, stopping climate change is going to be expensive. We know it's going to take trillions of dollars, a couple of $1 trillion a year. The world as a whole has just spent its first $1 trillion on climate change solutions. Adding up all the work we've done for years and years and years, it just ticked over the first $1 trillion mark. Now we need to be like 3 to 5 trillion a year, every year from now on, to even keep up. That's about this, comparable to the kind of investment we made in fossil fuels and industrial systems and so on. We need that similar level of investment. So we need, yes, government funding, but we also need private funding as well. We need philanthropy, we need investors, we need companies and governments to take resources out of bad things, divest from stuff that's hurting us, and invest into things that work. It's really that simple. Moving capital is a big part of what we need to do here. Not the only part, but a big part. And if we don't do that, we're not going to have the systems we need to power the world in the future. So we're starting to see some movement, and that's encouraging. But we need to keep up the pressure both on the divestment side of like, hey, I don't want my money in my retirement plan or my pension or my company's investments or whatever, or my bank or whatever, powering up the things that are hurting the planet. Let's see if we can pull money out of those things as much as possible. And activists have been pretty good at doing that for the last couple of years. In particular, have been really pretty effective there. But also, maybe more important than that is to invest money, not only in climate solutions, but in the right climate solutions. That's where we come in. This is where Drawdown is pointing out like, hey, these are the viable solutions. These are the ones that actually work. Other stuff could either be kind of a science project that might pay off in the future, or it's a big distraction. And we can help you find which one it is. But our list of climate solutions that work would be a good place to start. And we spent years refining that list. We also built this roadmap that shows how, like when, where, and in what sectors, and with which co-benefits are the best climate investing strategies. We're trying to get that in front of philanthropists, investors, governments all over the world. So if you want to help us connect to, if you know financial advisors, you know investment firms, you know big philanthropists or government agencies that are deploying capital, connect us. We are a really tiny team trying to do almost the impossible. We're trying to redirect the course of human history and trillions of dollars as a starting point to do that. And we're about, like a dozen or 2 dozen people trying to do that all by ourselves. That's pretty audacious. So we need your help. So please, please, please see if there are ways you can connect us to different kinds of interests that could help make that possible. That's where we need your help the most.
Thanks so much, John. We're getting a number of questions about connections between climate solutions and biodiversity. And I wonder if you might, and kind of co-benefits in emerging economies. And I wonder if you might talk a little bit about where Project Drawdown is moving in that space.
Oh, I'm glad you asked that. We're really excited about this. This is going to be a major focus for us, is showing that climate solutions are truly kind of bundled with solutions to things like biodiversity, water, soils, and other environmental problems. But then all of those are really linked to things that can improve human lives, improve human well-being, and ultimately address issues of equity and justice around the world. We've done some preliminary work on this that I showed already, showing 28 different strategies that link climate solutions to helping people living in extreme poverty, some of the most difficult, challenging situations in the world. And there are clear win-win benefits right there. And that's just the first step. The next thing we're doing is we're actually taking all of our climate solutions expertise and we're throwing it all out and starting over with a local solutions mapper for everywhere in the world, because climate solutions are local everywhere. It matters where you put the solar, the wind, the regenerative agriculture, the new forest, and so on. And that determines a lot of where those co-benefits to nature, especially biodiversity, is very local, as well as to people, because we live in local places. The air we breathe, the water we drink, the neighborhoods we're in, the kind of economic opportunities we see are local. So we need to take the big picture gigaton scale solutions over the world and drill down to the local everywhere. And then we can see where those co-benefits for equity, for justice, for nature really are the most powerful. And so this is something nobody's ever tried before, is make a global but local, down to the pixel level kind of climate solutions estimates everywhere in the world. And we're the first group on Earth even trying to do it. So stay tuned, it's going to be pretty awesome. But that's kind of the key to unlocking these kind of bundled benefits on the ground where the action is between climate and nature and people. And that's where we're going to get the big wins, I think. Local, I love that. Somebody invented a term in the chat.
Yeah, global, excellent. Also, just thanks everybody for the kind words. John, you're getting a lot of really kind words, including folks saying it's the best hour of time that they've spent in many years. So thanks to all of you for showing up. Thanks to John for this webinar. I'd love to give one more shout out. I know folks asked about how they can support Project Drawdown. I'd love to hear a little bit more from you about that, John, but then also like what you're excited about. You know, you've been in this space for a while now. During this moment in time, what's keeping you, what's getting you out of bed in the morning? What keeps you excited?
Well, like I said before, I mean, yeah, I started off as, I finished graduate school about 30 years ago this year, believe it or not. Getting more and more gray up in here. So again, in 30 years of working on some aspect of climate change or another, from the science to education to more kind of guiding action in this role, I've never been more optimistic. 30 years, I mean, it sounds weird because we have so many disasters happening. Yes, and I guess scientists, we already knew those were going to happen. We've been warning the world for years that stuff's going to happen. So that's not surprising me that much, that, yep, things are going to get worse for a little while, but the things that are getting better faster than I thought possible. Just 5 years ago, you know, would you have imagined an Inflation Reduction Act in the world? No, it would have been impossible to imagine that during the Trump administration, for example. Would you imagine this level of awareness and excitement around climate solutions? Would you have ever imagined that now solar and wind are by far the cheapest energy sources humanity has ever created, and they're falling in price faster than anyone ever thought possible? Or battery storage and LED lighting and heat pumps. The words heat pumps are everywhere now. That's fantastic. Or electric vehicles are beginning to take off exponentially. So we've been waiting a long time for these changes, but this is how change happens in the world. It's slowly, then all at once. I think we're hitting some good tipping points where things are going to get better quickly around the world. One other factoid I'll share with you, maybe to leave on a high note. Believe it or not, about 45 countries in the world, including the United States, the UK, and most Western democracies, are in fact cutting their emissions. Even when you adjust for trade with China and other countries and everything, they're still cutting their emissions. The US, we've cut ours about 20% since 2007. That's not fast enough, but we're starting to lower our emissions while the economy is still growing. And nobody thought that was possible, decoupling kind of emissions and pollution from economic activity. We need to do better. We need to question our economy, like what in it is really helping people versus what's producing crap and causing harm. We need to think about that harder, and that whole degrowth versus decoupling argument is a good one. But also, we show the proof of what's possible. We can solve this problem. I love this old quote, the Stone Age didn't end because we ran out of stones. We changed, we learned, we got better, we invented new ways of doing things. And I think climate solutions are not just climate solutions, they're just good things to do for the world anyway. And we'll get there. But the sooner we do, the less damage we've done along the way, and the better off we'll be. So that's what gets me up in the morning. And if you want to help us with that, keep doing what you're doing. Stay engaged, keep talking, spreading the word, helping us spread the word of what we're doing to other organizations. That'd be great. I hate to ask this, but we also do need financial help. It's a recession for a lot of us. Nonprofits are also seeing this around the world. And we love to have small donors from all corners of the globe helping us out. So if you're so inclined and so able and want to make a donation to Project Drawdown, we would be very, very grateful for that. But also other ways to help us and other organizations to share the word, promote us on social media, share with others, and learn and keep talking and keep challenging us. We are doing the best we can, but we get better thanks to all of you and the conversations we have with everybody out there. So please keep helping us with that, and we would really appreciate it.
Great. With that, thank you so much, John. For those of you who think hundreds and hundreds are on this webinar right now, so much gratitude to you, John, the larger Project Drawdown team, and everyone who showed up for Climate Solutions today. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all.
Recording will be sent out within the next week. Thanks all.
Thank you. Cheers.